Mark's morning had begun like any other. The soft hum of birdsong outside his window, the comforting aroma of brewing coffee drifting through the kitchen. He stepped outside into the warm embrace of spring sunlight, ready to tend to his garden before the day's errands. But then his eyes caught something that stopped him cold. There it was, a fence, a massive dark wooden barricade, tall and imposing, slicing across the far end of his backyard. But this wasn't just any fence. It was new, freshly stained, and most alarming of all, it wasn't where it was supposed to be. Mark's heart sank as he took a few cautious steps forward, eyes narrowing. This fence was a full 6 feet deeper into his yard than the original boundary line. His carefully tended rose bushes, his patch of wild daisies, even part of his old oak tree's sprawling roots were trapped behind this new wall of wood. Impossible, he muttered. She can't just take my land, but Karen could, and she did. Karen, the woman who lived 3 houses down, known to everyone as the neighborhood's self-appointed rule enforcer, the HOA's sharp-tongued watchdog, who delighted in policing paint colors and mailbox designs with ruthless precision. Mark had never gotten along with her, but he never imagined she'd cross this line. He stomped over to the fence and ran his hand along the cold, unforgiving wood, feeling the rough edges of his stolen territory. His mind raced. How long had it been there? Who had approved this? There'd been no notice, no letter slipped under his door, no warning from the HOA. With a knot tightening in his chest, Mark pulled out his phone and snapped a few pictures. Then he dialed the HOA president's number, hoping for an explanation. "Hello," came a clipped voice on the other end. "Hi, this is Mark Evans. I just noticed a fence on my property line." "Well, actually, it's inside my property by several feet. Has the HOA approved this?" Mark's voice was firm, but calm. A pause. Then, "We handle fence approvals at the monthly meetings. If the fence was built according to regulations, it's within your neighbor's rights." Mark clenched his jaw. "But no one told me, and this fence is clearly encroaching on my land. There's a process for disputes," the voice said flatly. "You can bring it up at the next meeting." Click. Mark stared at his phone, frustration bubbling into something darker. A sense of helplessness, of being boxed in. Karen had maneuvered around the rules, using the HOA's bureaucracy as a shield, and now she'd stolen a part of his backyard, without so much as a by your leave. He looked around his once open yard, now feeling smaller, trapped. The fence loomed like a fortress, a barrier not just of wood, but of power and control. A sudden flicker of anger sparked inside him. This wasn't just about a fence. It was about standing up to a bully who thought she could rewrite the rules to suit herself. But how? The HOA was a wall too, one he'd have to find a way to break through. Mark stepped back and glanced at the other neighbors. Most were going about their day, oblivious to the silent theft that had taken place in plain sight. But something told him that this was just the beginning. Karen's move was bold, maybe reckless, but it had shaken something in the neighborhood's fragile peace. And Mark, he wasn't going to let it go. He took a deep breath, fists clenched, eyes burning with determination. If Karen thought she'd win by fencing him out, she was about to learn that sometimes the quietest neighbor can start the loudest fight. The air in the community center was thick with quiet murmurs and the low hum of fluorescent lights. Mark tightened his grip on the folder of documents clutched in his hands, heart hammering with a mix of hope and dread. Tonight's HOA meeting would be his only chance to challenge Karen's fence officially, to bring his case before the people who controlled the neighborhood's rules. As neighbors filtered in, whispering in small clusters, Mark spotted Karen near the front table, She was immaculate, perfectly coiffed hair, crisp blouse, and that smug smile she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. Her eyes locked onto his with icy certainty. Mark swallowed hard and took a seat, knowing this confrontation would set the tone for everything to come. When the meeting was called to order, the president wasted no time. First item on the agenda, fence approvals, she announced, glancing at Karen. We have a new fence installed at 123 Maple Drive. Any comments? Karen stood, smooth and confident. Thank you. I followed all the guidelines outlined in the HOA rules. The fence enhances privacy and community aesthetics. The encroachment you may have heard about is a misunderstanding of the property lines. I assure you it is within the limits. Mark's pulse quickened. This was his moment. He rose slowly, voice steady, but charged with the anger he'd bottled up for weeks. With all due respect, Karen, the fence crosses my property line by at least 6 feet. I've got maps, property deeds, and surveyor reports that prove it. Karen's eyes narrowed, lips curling into a slight sneer. Those documents aren't valid unless approved by the HOA board. This is a community, and we follow the rules set forth by the association. The board members exchanged glances, some nodding toward Karen. Mark felt a chill settle deep in his chest. This wasn't going to be a fair fight. One of the board members, Mrs. Phelps, spoke up in a clipped tone. We must uphold the standards for the good of the neighborhood. Unless there's overwhelming evidence, the fence stands. Mark opened his folder and spread out the maps, pointing to the precise boundary lines. These are official records, filed with the county. The fence encroaches on my land, and no notice was given before construction. Karen cut in sharply. The HOA guidelines were met, and no one else has complained. This is a non-issue. The tension in the room mounted. Whispers rippled through the audience as neighbors looked between Mark and Karen. Sensing the deepening conflict, Mark scanned the room, searching for an ally. But most faces were neutral or subtly siding with Karen's polished confidence. When the president finally called for a vote, the result was devastating. The fence was deemed compliant with the HOA's interpretation, and Mark's protest was dismissed. Defeated but not broken, Mark sank into his chair, the weight of injustice pressing down on him. He watched Karen smirk triumphantly, the silent message clear. She had won. After the meeting, Mark lingered by the exit, overhearing murmurs from neighbors. Some whispered sympathies. Others expressed frustration with the HOA's favoritism. The sense of a community divided was palpable. On his way home, Mark's mind raced. Unwilling to accept defeat, if the HOA wouldn't help, he'd find another way. He recalled the old neighborhood maps he'd seen in the county office. And thought struck him like lightning. What if Karen's property had a vulnerability he hadn't considered? The night deepened around his house as Mark sat at his desk, surrounded by papers and glowing screens. He pulled up the property deed records and scanned every detail. Then, there it was. A clause buried deep in the legal jargon. Karen's home depended on a single private road, owned not by the HOA, but by an individual. Mark's eyes widened. Could it be? With cautious excitement, he dug deeper, pulling up deeds and ownership records. The road wasn't owned by Karen or the HOA. It was owned by someone else. A new plan began to form in Mark's mind, fueled by equal parts frustration and determination. The battle wasn't over. It was just getting started. The night had settled, deep and silent over the neighborhood. But inside Mark's small home office, a storm was raging. The soft glow of his laptop screen cast sharp shadows across his determined face as he pored over property records, maps, and legal documents, his mind racing faster than his fingers could scroll. His discovery from the previous night gnawed at him. Karen's house sat beyond a narrow private road, the only route connecting her property to the outside world. Unlike the paved public streets maintained by the city and the HOA, this stretch of asphalt was technically owned by an individual, not a collective association or the local government. Could this be the loophole he needed? A tiny crack in Karen's fortress that could turn the entire neighborhood power dynamic on its head. Mark grabbed a yellow legal pad and began jotting notes, sketching out the road's layout relative to Karen's property and the surrounding homes. His pulse quickened with the possibility, if he could acquire ownership of that road, or at least control access, Karen's entire house would be cut off from the world. He leaned back in his chair, a mix of adrenaline and doubt swirling inside him. But first, he needed to confirm the ownership details. The next morning, armed with coffee and steely resolve, Mark drove to the county records office. The sterile building smelled faintly of old paper and dust, and the clerk eyed him curiously as he requested the latest deeds for the neighborhood's private roads. Minutes later, he sat at a battered desk, scanning the official documents. There, it was in black and white. The private road leading directly to Karen's home was owned by an individual named James Thornton, a name Mark recognized. A reclusive elderly man, rumored to have once lived in the neighborhood, but who had since moved away, leaving his property in limbo. Mark's mind raced. James Thornton had not paid HOA fees in years and had no apparent heirs. The property was essentially abandoned. The question was it for sale? He made a quick phone call to the county assessor's office. Yes, the clerk confirmed. The deed is still active. The property is listed as owned by James Thornton. We haven't had any sales recorded recently. Mark's fingers tightened around the phone. The path ahead was clear. If he could find a way to buy that road from James, or his estate, he'd hold the key to Karen's only access. But this was a dangerous game. Karen was ruthless. She had friends on the HOA board and a sharp legal and team ready to squash anyone who crossed her. Mark knew if she found out what he was planning, she'd fight back hard. Maybe harder than he could imagine. Returning home, Mark called his closest neighbors, those who had quietly expressed frustration about Karen's bullying tactics. Listen, he said, voice low and urgent. I might have found something. Karen's only access road isn't owned by the HOA. It belongs to someone else. If I buy it, I control her access. We can finally stand up to her. A pause, then hesitant agreement. The fear was palpable, but the spark of hope burned brighter. Mark spent the next days contacting estate lawyers and tracking down James Thornton's family or representatives, piecing together the puzzle. Late one evening, he received a breakthrough. An attorney responded with interest in selling the road property, citing neglect and lack of use. The stakes suddenly became real. Meanwhile, Karen continued her campaign of intimidation, sending notices about supposed violations and watching Mark closely. Suspense mounted as Mark knew he was walking a tightrope. One wrong move could backfire disastrously. But Mark had tasted the bitter fruit of Karen's power, and he refused to be a victim. He drafted an offer, preparing for a transaction that could rewrite the neighborhood's rules forever. Mark's heart pounded as he signed the final papers in the dim light of his kitchen table. The deed to the private road, Karen's only route in and out of her home, was now officially his. The reality hit him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a piece of asphalt anymore. It was power, leverage, and the start of a reckoning he had only dreamed of. The next morning, Mark awoke to the uneasy quiet of the neighborhood. The birds still sang, and the sun cast a golden glow over the manicured lawns. But for Mark, everything felt different. His world was shifting underfoot, and Karen was about to feel the ground slip away. Word spread fast. A few neighbors approached, Mark cautiously, their eyes filled with a mix of admiration and fear. "You really bought the road," whispered Mrs. Jenkins from across the street. "Bold move," murmured Mr. Lopez, who had often been bullied by Karen's petty rules. But Karen, she was furious. It took her only a few hours to discover Mark's new ownership when she went to drive home and found a bright, imposing sign nailed to the road entrance. Private property. Access controlled by Mark Evans. Her phone rang off the hook as she fumed in her car, trying to reach Mark. He didn't answer. The community was buzzing. Some whispered about the audacity of Mark's move. Others worried about the escalating feud. The HOA board was blindsided, scrambling to figure out how this power shift would affect the entire neighborhood. Mark's plan was simple, but nerve-wracking. He installed a secure gate at the entrance of the road, equipped with an electronic lock controlled by him. The gate stood as a silent sentinel, blocking Karen's access. No more late-night fence patrols or unsolicited violation letters. For now, Karen was the one locked out. Days passed in tense silence. Karen's fury simmered beneath the surface, boiling over into whispered threats and legal warnings sent to Mark's door. But Mark remained calm, knowing the upper hand was finally his. Neighbors began to notice the change. Some offered quiet support. Others crossed the street to avoid the growing drama. The once peaceful neighborhood had turned into a chessboard. With every move watched closely. One afternoon, Karen stormed over to Mark's house, face flushed with anger. "You think this makes you powerful?" she spat, pounding her fist on his door. "You have no idea what you're messing with." Mark met her glare with steady eyes. "I'm just tired of being pushed around," he said quietly. "This fence took my land. Now I'm just leveling the playing field." Karen's jaw clenched, but she left without another word. Behind the scenes, the HOA board convened emergency meetings, debating how to respond. Some argued that Mark's ownership of the road was legitimate and legal. Others feared this could set a dangerous precedent. Karen lobbied hard to regain control, leveraging her connections and influence. But Mark was ready. He had lawyered up, prepared for whatever legal firestorm came next. More than that, he had something no one expected. The quiet confidence of a man who had turned the tables and refused to be intimidated. The stage was set for a showdown, unlike any the neighborhood had seen before. The lines were drawn, alliances formed and broken in whispers. Every neighbor watched with bated breath, because, in this quiet suburb, the battle for a strip of asphalt was about to decide who really held the power. Early dawn broke quietly over the neighborhood, but Mark's mind was anything but calm. He had spent the previous night preparing for the moment that would change everything, installing the gate that would finally give him control over Karen's only access to her home. The gate itself was a sleek, black, wrought iron structure, strong but elegant. Its hinges gleamed in the morning light as Mark, alone but resolute, affixed it across the narrow private road. He connected the electronic lock to his phone, the cold metal a tangible symbol of his quiet rebellion. As he finished the last bolt, Mark's phone buzzed with a string of messages from neighbors, some anxious, others quietly cheering him on. He took a deep breath and locked the gate remotely for the first time. Moments later, Karen arrived, her sleek black SUV pulling up to the newly erected barrier. She slammed on the brakes, eyes widening in disbelief, as she stared at the locked gate blocking her way. "No!" she hissed under her breath. "This isn't happening." She fumbled with her phone, trying to call Mark, the HOA board, anyone who could help her get through. But Mark's phone remained silent. He refused to answer. For the first time, Karen felt the raw sting of being powerless. Neighbors began gathering quietly at a distance, watching the drama unfold. Some whispered among themselves. Others filmed the scene on their phones, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen paced back and forth, rage boiling beneath her composed exterior. Her carefully constructed control was slipping through her fingers. Without access to the road, her life was effectively trapped inside her own property. Meanwhile, Mark stood at his window across the street, watching Karen's fury like a hawk. His chest tightened with a mix of satisfaction and caution. He knew this was only the opening move in a battle that would test both their wills. Days passed with no compromise. Karen sent Mark a barrage of legal threats, claiming the gate was an illegal obstruction. She pressured the HOA board to intervene, but the board's hands were tied. Mark owned the road outright, and the law was on his side. The neighborhood buzzed with speculation and fear. Would Karen escalate? Would she find a way around the gate? Or would Mark's bold move finally force her to back down? Then, a sudden twist. One night, a mysterious figure was spotted near the gate. A shadow slipping through the darkness, carefully manipulating the lock. When Mark checked his phone the next morning, he saw alerts from his security cameras, showing someone tampering. With the gate in the dead of night, suspense ratcheted up. Was Karen trying to regain access by stealth? Or was there another player in this high-stakes game? Mark increased his security, installing additional cameras and alarms. The quiet neighborhood was no longer so peaceful. Meanwhile, Karen's frustration turned to desperation. Unable to reach her home by road, she began making whispered calls to city officials, hinting at zoning violations and demanding emergency access. The pressure mounted on Mark as legal letters piled up, each more threatening than the last. But Mark stood firm. He had fought too hard to give in now. The battle lines were drawn, and every day brought new twists and turns. The neighborhood watched, captivated by the unfolding drama. A story of power, pride, an offense that sparked a war no one expected. The morning sun filtered weakly through the blinds of Mark's living room, casting long shadows over piles of unopened envelopes and thick legal documents. The once peaceful neighborhood was now a battleground, and Mark was caught in the crossfire of Karen's relentless campaign to regain control. It began with a letter from Karen's lawyer, accusing Mark of unlawfully obstructing access to her property. The language was sharp and threatening, demanding immediate removal of the gate or face a lawsuit. But this was just the opening salvo. Within days, Mark received a notice from the HOA, pressured by Karen's persistent lobbying. They demanded he unlock the gate pending an investigation. Mark's heart sank, but he refused to back down. He had the deed. The road was his property, and his right to control it was backed by county law. Still, the pressure mounted. Karen's legal team sent multiple cease and desist letters, warning of damages and harassment claims. Then, the county zoning board announced a formal hearing to review the situation. The tension rippled through the community as neighbors took sides, some quietly rooting for Mark's David versus Karen's Goliath, others fearful the feud would ruin the neighborhood's harmony. The hearing day arrived, and Mark sat nervously in the packed room. Karen appeared radiant and composed, dressed sharply, her legal team well prepared. The HOA representatives sat beside her, their faces tight with concern. When the hearing began, Karen's lawyer launched into a fierce argument. "The gate is a private nuisance," he declared. "It unlawfully restricts access, endangering my client's property rights and emergency services." Mark's attorney countered calmly, presenting the official deeds, surveys, and county regulations. "Mr. Evans legally owns the road in question. The gate's placement and lock are within his rights. There has been no violation of law." The hearing stretched on, both sides presenting evidence, witnesses, and testimony. Tension simmered as neighbors listened, some visibly anxious, others riveted by the unfolding drama. The community center, once a place for friendly gatherings, felt more like a courtroom. Outside, murmurs swirled. Local news caught wind of the story, sending reporters to the neighborhood. What began as a private dispute was becoming a public spectacle, threatening to spiral beyond anyone's control. Days later, the zoning board's ruling arrived. The decision was a compromise. Mark could keep the gate, but had to provide emergency access within 5 minutes upon request. Both parties were to negotiate a formal access agreement under the HOA's oversight. Karen declared a hollow victory, but vowed to keep fighting. Mark felt the sting of a partial win, but knew the real battle was far from over. Back at home, Mark's phone buzzed with another message. This time, an anonymous tip. "Watch your back. Karen's not done yet." A chill ran down his spine. Mark stared out the window at the gate, his symbol of defiance and control, but also a magnet for conflict. The war was intensifying, and the next moves could change everything. The aftermath of the zoning board's ruling left the neighborhood simmering with uneasy quiet. Mark tried to catch his breath, but the tension in the air was thicker than ever. The gate stood firm, yet behind the calm surface, the battle was growing far more personal and dangerous. Karen's fury had taken a darker turn. The anonymous tip Mark received was just the beginning. Strange things began to happen around his property. Tires slashed on his car, garden tools mysteriously vanished, and late at night, unfamiliar footsteps echoed near his house. The quiet suburb was turning into a minefield. Mark knew Karen was ruthless, but this level of intimidation was beyond anything he had expected. He called the police to report the vandalism, but with no direct evidence, there was little they could do. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, something unexpected happened. Several neighbors, tired of Karen's tyranny, but too afraid to speak out publicly, reached out to Mark privately. They shared stories of their own brushes with Karen's power, stories never told at HOA meetings. One evening, Mrs. Jenkins knocked on Mark's door, clutching a small box of old letters and photographs. "You need to see this," she said quietly. "Karen's influence goes deeper than we thought." Inside the box was a collection of correspondence between Karen and former HOA board members. Letters revealing attempts to manipulate votes, threaten dissenters, and maintain control through fear. The revelations painted a chilling picture of a woman who had built her empire on intimidation and silence. Mark's mind raced. If he could expose Karen's manipulations, it might turn the tide. Together with a small group of brave neighbors, Mark began gathering evidence, documenting everything carefully. Late nights were spent piecing together a case that could finally bring Karen down, legally and socially. But Karen was no fool. She sensed the shifting winds and struck back harder. Rumors began to spread about Mark. Accusations of harassment, false claims of property violations, whispers of mental instability. The neighborhood became a battlefield of whispered loyalties and fractured friendships. Mark felt isolated but determined. He doubled down, sharing the evidence with his lawyer, and preparing a counter-complaint against Karen for harassment and HOA rule violations. Then came the most surprising development. One of Karen's closest allies, a board member named Greg, quietly approached Mark. Karen's methods are hurting everyone. Greg confessed, "I want out, and I can help you." This unexpected alliance shocked Mark. Greg's insider knowledge was invaluable, offering insights into HOA procedures and Karen's vulnerabilities. As the community watched, the power dynamics began to shift. Karen's grip weakened as neighbors found courage in unity, emboldened by the truth coming to light. But Mark knew the final act was still ahead. A showdown where secrets would be revealed, alliances tested, and the fate of the neighborhood decided. The tension was unbearable, the stakes higher than ever, and the question loomed: would justice prevail, or would Karen's empire crush anyone who dared stand in her way? The day of the HOA's emergency meeting arrived like a thunderstorm, rolling over the neighborhood, tense, charged, and inevitable. The community center was packed, every seat filled with neighbors eager to witness the showdown that had consumed their quiet suburb for months. Mark stood at the front, flanked by Greg and a handful of other neighbors who had bravely come forward with evidence against Karen. Across the room, Karen sat cold and composed, her eyes sharp with calculation, her legal team poised and ready. The meeting began with Karen launching into a fierce defense, painting herself as the victim of a conspiracy, accusing Mark of trespassing, harassment, and attempts to destabilize the HOA. Her voice was confident, practiced, but beneath the surface, a flicker of uncertainty betrayed her. Then Greg took the floor. His testimony was precise and damning. He revealed the secret correspondence, the manipulated votes, the intimidation tactics Karen had used to maintain control. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as the truth emerged like a wildfire. Karen's facade cracked. She tried to interrupt, to deny, but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. The neighbors listened, eyes wide with shock and relief, finally understanding how deep Karen's grip had been. Mark stepped forward next, sharing his story. Not just about the fence or the gate, but about reclaiming dignity and standing up to bullying. His voice was steady, filled with the resolve of someone who had been pushed too far and refused to back down. The HOA board members exchanged glances, the tide of opinion turning swiftly. When the vote was called to remove Karen from the board and revoke her special privileges, it was unanimous. But just as the room erupted in murmurs of victory, the real twist came. Karen stood, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Before you celebrate," she said, "there's one more thing." She pulled out a thick envelope and handed it to the HOA president. Inside were signed documents, Karen's formal relinquishment of her property's access rights to the private road. She had sold her rights, not to Mark, but to the HOA itself, ensuring the road would be maintained for all residents, free from individual control. The room fell silent. Karen explained that after months of conflict, she realized her tactics had only isolated her. By selling the road rights to the HOA, she was forcing a new era of shared responsibility and, in a surprising gesture, extending a tentative olive branch to Mark and the community. Mark felt a rush of conflicting emotions. The battle had changed the landscape entirely. His fight for justice had not just toppled a tyrant, but reshaped the neighborhood's future. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors gathered outside, exchanging hopeful glances. The gate that once symbolized division was gone. A new path forward was open, both literally and figuratively. Mark and Karen crossed paths briefly. No words were exchanged, but a quiet understanding passed between them. The war was over, and as the sun set on the neighborhood, the once fraught road stretched out, a symbol of reclaimed power, shared respect, and the hard-won peace born from conflict.